Here are 3 true scary stories about maniacs. Story number 1. The Cannibal Who Walks Free. The disturbing case of Issei Sagawa. In 1981, a Japanese student murdered and ate his classmate in Paris. He was caught, declared insane, and deported. Today, he is a free man, famous, even celebrated for his crime. The story of Issei Sagawa is one of the most horrifying cases of cannibalism in modern history. He killed and ate his classmate Renee Hartevelt in his Paris apartment. He was caught red-handed while trying to dispose of her body. He confessed immediately, but was never punished. Instead, he was deported to Japan and set free. To this day, he has never served a single day in prison. Instead, he became a celebrity cannibal, writing books, appearing on talk shows, and even starring in horror films. How did this happen? This is the terrifying true story of Issei Sagawa, the real-life Hannibal Lecter. Who is Issei Sagawa? Issei Sagawa was born in 1949 in Kobe, Japan, into a wealthy and powerful family. He was small and frail, suffering from a rare birth defect that made him weak. He had an extremely high IQ, but struggled socially. By his teens, he had violent fantasies about eating human flesh. Sagawa later admitted that he first thought about cannibalism at age 7, after seeing a classmate's bare thigh and wondering what it would taste like. Despite his disturbing thoughts, he excelled in school and later moved to Paris to study literature at the Sorbonne University. But while he was there, his cannibalistic urges became uncontrollable. The murder of Renee Hartevelt, June 11, 1981. The victim, Renee Hartevelt. Renee Hartevelt was a 25-year-old Dutch student, studying in Paris alongside Sagawa. She was beautiful, intelligent, and kind, the perfect target for Sagawa's twisted desires. He later admitted he became obsessed with her, watching her from afar, fantasizing about eating her flesh. The plan. On June 11, 1981, Sagawa invited Renee to his apartment under the pretense of working on a poetry project together. She had no idea she would never leave. The murder. As Renee sat at Sagawa's desk reading poetry, he quietly walked behind her, pulled out a rifle, and shot her in the neck. She died instantly, collapsing onto the floor. Instead of feeling guilt, Sagawa felt excitement. He later recalled, "The moment I killed her, I felt like I had finally become my true self." The cannibalism. I wanted to absorb her energy. With Renee's body still warm, Sagawa undressed her, laid her on the bed, and began his gruesome feast. First, he tried to bite in her flesh, but found it too tough. He used a butcher's knife to cut into her thigh. He cooked some flesh and ate it. He chewed raw pieces of her body, savoring the taste. Over the next 2 days, Sagawa continued eating Renee's body, storing parts of her in the refrigerator. He later described the experience. "Her flesh melted in my mouth like raw tuna." His goal, he said, was to absorb her beauty, intelligence, and energy by consuming her. The attempt to dispose of the body. After 2 days, the smell of decay became overwhelming. Realizing he couldn't keep the body much longer, Sagawa decided to dispose of the remains. He packed Renee's body into 2 suitcases and called a taxi to take him to Bois de Boulogne, a park outside Paris. But as he dragged the heavy suitcases across the park, people noticed his suspicious behavior. 2 passers-by called the police. When officers arrived and opened the suitcases, they found Renee's mutilated remains inside. Sagawa was arrested immediately. The trial. Why wasn't he punished? Sagawa confessed immediately. He admitted to killing Renee and eating her body. He showed no remorse, only regret that he had not eaten more. He should have spent the rest of his life in prison. But that's not what happened. The insanity ruling. After a psychiatric evaluation, French courts declared Sagawa legally insane and unfit to stand trial. Instead of being sentenced to prison, he was sent to a mental institution in France. But this was only the beginning. The shocking release, a free man in Japan. Sagawa's wealthy and influential father lobbied to have him transferred back to Japan. Once he was returned to Japan, something unbelievable happened. Since the French courts had ruled him legally insane, Japanese authorities dropped all charges. He was set free. Just 5 years after murdering and eating a woman, Sagawa walked out of the mental hospital a free man. The celebrity cannibal, Sagawa profits from his crime. Instead of hiding in shame, Sagawa became a celebrity. He wrote best-selling books detailing the murder in graphic detail. He appeared on talk shows, describing how human flesh tastes. He even starred in horror movies, playing a fictionalized version of himself. For years, he profited from his crime, gaining fame for his horrific actions. Later years, the cannibal's fall from grace. As time passed, Sagawa's fame faded. He became a social outcast, unable to find work or friends. He fell into poverty, relying on government assistance. In 2013, he suffered a stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed. By 2018, he was living with his brother, unable to care for himself. In November 2022, Issei Sagawa died at age 73, never having served a single day in prison. Why was Sagawa never punished? The case of Issei Sagawa remains one of the greatest failures of the justice system. He confessed to murder. He admitted to eating his victim. He never showed remorse. Yet he was allowed to walk free. Was it his father's influence? A loophole in international law? A failure of the system? No matter the reason, the fact remains. A self-confessed murderer and cannibal lived freely for over 40 years. Final thoughts. A true horror story. The case of Issei Sagawa is more than just a crime story. It is a nightmare come to life. A man killed and ate another human being, then became famous for it. His story is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not in movies or myths. They walk among us. Story number 2. The Toy Box Killer. The man who turned a trailer into a torture chamber. Hello there. Be asterisk. You're going to be kept here for a while. I've done this many times. Asterisk. This chilling audio recording was played for the victims of David Parker Ray, one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history. He kidnapped women, locked them inside a soundproof trailer, and tortured them for days or weeks. His toy box was a customized torture chamber filled with whips, chains, medical instruments, and electrocution devices. He kept detailed journals of his victims, but no bodies were ever found. For years, he kidnapped countless women, using drugs to erase their memories before releasing them. Some victims didn't even know they had been abducted, until one woman escaped and uncovered one of the most horrifying crime scenes in history. Who was David Parker Ray? David Parker Ray was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico. He was raised by an abusive grandfather, while his father abandoned him at a young age. As a child, he was obsessed with violent pornography and bondage magazines. By his teenage years, he fantasized about kidnapping and torturing women. Unlike many serial killers, Ray was never officially linked to any murders, because he was an expert at making his victims disappear. The horror inside the toy box. Ray worked as a mechanic in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. But behind his normal appearance, he was building something monstrous. He purchased a $100,000 trailer and converted it into a torture chamber, calling it his toy box. Inside, investigators later found whips, chains, surgical scalpels, and saws, electrocution devices, and sex toys modified for torture, a gynecological chair with metal restraints, a mirror on the ceiling. So victims were forced to watch their own suffering. And the most horrifying thing of all, a tape recording, the audio tape. a killer's welcome message. Each time Ray kidnapped a woman, he would play a pre-recorded tape explaining what was about to happen. Here's part of what victims heard. Hello there, B****. You're probably wondering why you're here. You are obviously here against your will. You're going to be kept naked and chained like an animal for a while. The things I do to you will be very painful. I've done this many times, so don't scream. No one can hear you. The full recording lasted over 30 minutes. It was pure psychological torture, designed to break victims before the real pain even started. How David Parker Ray kidnapped his victims. Ray didn't act alone. He had accomplices including Cindy Hendy, his girlfriend and partner in crime. His daughter, Jessie Ray, helped lure women into the toy box. His friend, Dennis Yancey, assisted in at least one murder. Together, they would pick vulnerable women, often prostitutes or runaways, and lure them in with promises of money, drugs, or safety. Once inside, Ray would drug them, chain them, and begin his games. Some victims were murdered. Others were brainwashed, drugged, and set free, without memory of what happened. The woman who escaped, March 22, 1999. For years, no one knew what was happening inside the toy box. But then, one woman broke free. Her name was Cynthia Vigil. Ray and Cindy Hendy kidnapped her from a parking lot, drugged her, and locked her inside the toy box. For 3 days, she was tortured, electrocuted, and beaten. But then, Cindy made a mistake. While Ray was at work, Cindy left the keys too close to Cynthia. Cynthia grabbed them, unlocked her chains, and attacked Cindy Hendy with an ice pick. She ran out of the trailer, naked, bleeding, and covered in chains, screaming for help. A neighbor called the police, and Cynthia's story revealed the full horror of the toy box. The shocking discovery, the toy box, and the journals. When police raided David Parker Ray's trailer, they were horrified. They found videotapes of his victims being tortured. They discovered detailed journals listing over 60 women. They found photos, bloody restraints, and training manuals for new victims. But there was one major problem. They couldn't find a single body. How many women did he kill? Despite all the evidence, police never found bodies. Ray was a meticulous killer. He buried his victims in the desert. He fed remains to wild animals. He burned bones or dissolved them in acid. Some police believe he killed over 60 women, but the exact number remains unknown. The trial, justice without closure. Once arrested, Ray faced multiple trials, but prosecutors struggled to convict him because so many victims had no memory of what happened. Eventually, Cynthia Vigil, Angelica Montano, and Kelly Garrett testified against him. Sentences: David Parker Ray, sentenced to 224 years in prison. Cindy Hendy, sentenced to 36 years. Dennis Yancey, sentenced to 30 years for one confirmed murder. Jessie Ray, his daughter, served only 5 years. But in a final twist of fate, Ray never served his full sentence. In 2002, just 3 years after his conviction, he died of a heart attack in prison. The unanswered questions. David Parker Ray may be dead, but his secrets remain. Where are the bodies? How many women did he really kill? Are there survivors who don't even know what happened to them? To this day, many families believe their missing daughters were victims of the toy box killer. But without bodies, they may never know for sure. The unanswered questions. David Parker Ray may be dead, but his secrets remain. Where are the bodies? How many women did he really kill? Are there survivors who don't even know what happened to them? To this day, many families believe their missing daughters were victims of the toy box killer. But without bodies, they may never know for sure. Story number 3. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, Russia's most sadistic serial killer. Between 1978 and 1990, dozens of people disappeared across Soviet Russia. Their bodies, when found, bore signs of extreme torture: eyes gouged out, tongues bitten off, and deep stab wounds. For over a decade, the police hunted a ruthless killer who preyed on women and children. When they finally caught him, he confessed to 56 murders, but the true number may be much higher. This is the horrific true story of Andrei Chikatilo, one of the most sadistic serial killers in history. Who was Andrei Chikatilo? Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic under Stalin's brutal regime. He grew up during the Holodomor, a man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians. His mother terrified him as a child by telling him that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors. He was severely bullied at school for his weak physique and shy personality. He suffered from impotence, which made him feel inferior and powerless. By the time he was an adult, these childhood traumas had twisted him into a monster. The first murder, 1978, the girl who never came home. Chikatilo's first known murder occurred in 1978 when he lured a 9-year-old girl, Yelena Zakitnova, into an abandoned house. He attempted to rape her, but failed due to his impotence. Instead, he stabbed her repeatedly, and in his frenzy, realized he felt pleasure from the act of killing. Her body was found floating in a nearby river, bearing multiple stab wounds. Shockingly, Chikatilo was not arrested for the crime. Instead, an innocent man, Alexander Kravchenko, was convicted and executed for the murder. With no one suspecting him, Chikatilo continued his killing spree for over a decade. The Killing Spree, 1980s, a trail of brutality across Russia. Between 1981 and 1990, Chikatilo slaughtered at least 52 people, mostly young women and children. His methods were extremely brutal. He lured victims to isolated locations, pretending to be a friendly uncle figure. He stabbed them repeatedly, often dozens of times. He bit off body parts and gouged out their eyes, believing that the last image seen before death was stored in the eyes. He mutilated their genitals and sometimes removed internal organs. Some victims had their tongues bitten off in their final moments of terror. Many of his victims were homeless children, runaways, or young women traveling alone, making them easy prey. His favorite hunting grounds were train stations, forests, and bus stops, where he could find vulnerable people looking for help. How Chikatilo avoided capture for over a decade. Despite leaving a trail of bodies, Chikatilo remained free for years due to Soviet police incompetence and outdated forensic methods. 1. Innocent men were blamed. The Soviet government refused to believe a serial killer could exist in communist Russia. Instead, they arrested and executed at least 6 innocent men for his crimes. 2. He changed his appearance. Chikatilo kept a low profile, working as a teacher and later as a factory worker. He was a family man, married with children, which helped him avoid suspicion. 3. He confused investigators with his motives. Unlike many serial killers, Chikatilo was not motivated by sex alone. His crimes were about control, power, and sadistic pleasure. His impotence meant he couldn't perform sexually, but he discovered that murder gave him satisfaction. Because of these factors, he was able to continue killing for over a decade. The arrest. The day the monster was caught, 1990. By 1990, police finally noticed a pattern in the killings and began watching train stations. One officer, Igor Rybakov, noticed a suspicious man approaching young children at a bus stop. It was Chikatilo. When officers arrested him, they found a knife, a length of rope, a jar of Vaseline. Though this was not enough evidence to convict him, they kept him under surveillance until DNA evidence linked him to the crimes. The confession. Chikatilo admits to 56 murders. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Chikatilo finally confessed to killing 56 people. His chilling confession shocked even the most hardened detectives. He described his murders in graphic detail, often laughing while recounting the killings. When asked why he gouged out victims' eyes, he said, "I thought they could still see me after death." The trial, A Monster in a Cage, 1992. Chikatilo's trial in 1992 became one of the most infamous in Russian history. He was kept inside a metal cage to protect him from enraged victims' families. Survivors and relatives of his victims screamed for his execution. At one point, he dropped his pants in the courtroom to prove he was impotent. After a dramatic trial, he was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. The execution, 1994, a bullet to the head. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was led into a soundproof execution chamber. He was forced to kneel. A single bullet was fired into his head. His body was quickly buried in an unmarked grave. His death brought justice, but the scars he left on Russia remain. How many did he really kill? Chikatilo confessed to 56 murders, but many believe the true number is over 80. Many victims were never identified. Some bodies were never found. Some murders were never linked to him because of Soviet police corruption. Even today, investigators suspect he killed many more. Final thoughts. The butcher of Rostov's lasting horror. Andrei Chikatilo was one of the most sadistic serial killers in history. He preyed on the weak and vulnerable. He committed acts of torture beyond imagination. He escaped justice for over a decade, killing with impunity. His case remains one of the most disturbing in true crime history, a reminder that true monsters do exist. And for the families of his victims, his name will always be spoken with horror. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more stories.